My name's Lucas, I'm 18 years old, and I've been growing tomatoes in my urban home garden since 2012. Roll clips from last year's harvest. Over the years, I've had some pretty great success with tomatoes. So today, I'm going to show you how I plant my tomatoes for huge harvests of delicious, flavorful fruit. Let's get started. So the first step is to get yourself a tomato plant. Now this here is a Bonnie Best. It's an heirloom beefsteak variety that I've never grown before, but I'm growing it for the first time this year because my grandpa actually recommended it. Next, you need to pick out a spot that gets about 8 hours of sunlight every day. A lot of sources say 6 to 8 hours, but ideally at least 8, even upwards of 10 to 11 hours a day is ideal for maximum growth. Because tomato plants, like any plant, need sunlight for photosynthesis to really grow to their maximum potential. And I've personally found that when I grow my tomatoes in my front yard versus my backyard, which has a lot more shade, I find that the tomatoes in the front grow a lot bigger, and the actual fruits and the flowers are a lot more prolific. And that's just due to sunlight. So before even planting your tomatoes, one of the first things you should be thinking about is it indeterminate or is it determinate? So basically what that means is it's the growth habit of the plant. Indeterminates, basically what that means is the plant just keeps growing all season long, and it'll produce fruit all the way up the plant and in a consecutive way. Whereas determinate plants, they basically produce all their flowers and fruit kind of in one flush, and then the plant's basically done. So that's the basics. I have a whole video on that, link in the description. The reason you need to know the type is because you want to know what type of support method to use. Now, if you're growing determinate types, I would highly recommend some sort of caging support, because determinates are usually pretty bushy plants and you should not prune them. And the reason you shouldn't prune them is because if you do, you're basically going to be throwing away fruit, since the plant only grows to a set height and it produces all its fruit at once. For indeterminates, you have multiple options. You can use cages. Now, I use these concrete reinforcement mesh cages. I built them myself. I'm actually going to be doing a video on these cages and what I like about them coming soon. But another method is to use stakes or some sort of vertical string or trellising system. Now, I just like to use stakes. 6 foot tall stake. I'm using bamboo. Bamboo is an awesome material for supporting plants because it's pretty cheap, it's lightweight, and it doesn't break that easily. So it's pretty tough. I always put my stake in the ground before I plant, and the reason I do that is because I don't want to have any risk of damaging the roots. Because if I were to plant this plant here, and I were to shove that stake into the ground, I could potentially be skewering a lot of the roots. And that's gonna basically stunt the plant, and it might recover, but I like to keep as many roots intact as I can when I plant. That's gonna ensure that you're gonna have the best transplant success, least transplant shock, so that's what I always do. So the next thing that I do is I set my tomato plant aside, and I basically just dig a hole beside the stake, just a couple inches away from the stake. And as a general rule, I'd say dig the hole just a little deeper than the cup or pot that your plant's in, especially for tomato plants, and I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. So once your hole's dug, now you're going to want to add some special ingredients. So the first thing that I add to my planting hole is compost. Now, I use composted manure. So I use a handful of sheep manure compost, a handful of cattle manure, composted cattle manure, And then I just add a handful of 3-in-1 mix. So this is going to basically be used to increase the organic matter content in the soil, and it's going to help feed your tomato plant slowly throughout the season. The key is for tomato plants is you want slow release nutrients, but you also want fast release nutrients. So this stuff here, this is organic. It's going to be slow release throughout the season, feeding your tomato plant's roots all season long. Compost and manure and compost in general is great to add to the planting hole because it's a great source of all kinds of different nutrients, including micronutrients and microorganisms as well, to build the health of your soil. It's organic, it's slow release nutrients, but the thing you got to keep in mind with compost is that it contains lots of nitrogen, especially compost and manure. And this can cause lots of leaves and not many tomatoes. So I just add a bit at the beginning of the season just to get my plants off to a good start. So once I have my compost in the planting hole, what I do is I take some bone meal. Bone meal is organic as far as I can tell. The purpose of adding bone meal is that bone meal is a very high source of phosphorus, and phosphorus is used in root development, and it's also used in flower and fruit development in plants. So with tomatoes, you want to have the most roots you can possibly have, because more roots means that your plants can absorb more water and more nutrients faster, and they can access it from deeper in the ground, which, more nutrients, more water, the healthier the plant's going to be. And another reason you need phosphorus is, like I said before, it's used for fruit development and flower development. Now, one of the biggest things people do wrong when they plant tomatoes is they actually put in way too much nitrogen. And nitrogen is basically, it's another element that basically stimulates green growth, leaf growth, foliage. It's one of the biggest ingredients in lawn fertilizer. And phosphorus is basically more focused on the roots and the flowers. And with tomatoes, of course, you want to boost flower production, because more flowers equals more fruits in the end. And also that phosphorus is just going to help blow up your fruits, make them nice and big, nice and juicy for you to eat. So if you've ever bought fertilizer, you may have noticed that there's 3 numbers on it, and those represent NPK. And what that means is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, nitrogen, the way I like to look at it, is it's for shoots and leaves, green growth essentially. And phosphorus is mainly for roots and fruits. That's what I like to think of it, roots and fruits. And then potassium is just, in general, it's for overall plant health. So it's for pretty much, it's your all-around nutrient. And these are called macronutrients, which means that they're basically like your major nutrients that plants need. Of course, there's all kinds of other micronutrients, minerals that plants are going to need, but these are just your big 3, your essential nutrients. So when you're growing tomatoes, phosphorus is key. In general, I'd probably say phosphorus is way more important than nitrogen. Of course, you do need a good amount of nitrogen as well, but definitely you can overdo it on the nitrogen. It'll cause you to get massive, healthy, lush plants, and you won't get many tomatoes. So phosphorus from the bone meal is going to be key. Now this bone meal right here has the ratio of 4:10:0. So that's the NPK ratio. So what the ratio is it's basically the percentage of the different elements. So in the case of my bone meal, it's 4% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 0% potassium. So that means that we're really high in phosphorus, really high in boosting that root growth, giving your plants a solid foundation, and also it's going to help fruiting later on. So the next thing I add just a small amount of ground eggshells. Now this is white powdery ground eggshells right here. As you can see, not too much, just a little, just picked up a bit there, and I just sprinkle it on there. So what's the purpose of adding eggshells? Well,
Eggshells are actually an amazing source of calcium, and calcium is used in fruit development mainly, and that's why you may have seen something called blossom end rot. It's where the ends of the tomatoes start to actually rot before your tomatoes even ripen sometimes, or possibly once they start to ripen, but this is just a rot that's caused by inadequate calcium uptake into your tomato plants. And adding eggshells is basically going to ensure that your plant is going to be able to easily access calcium, take it up into the stem and into the fruits, and it's really going to make sure that you don't get that blossom end rot. Calcium deficiency is not only caused by lack of calcium. You could have calcium in your soil, but your plant's just not taking it up. It's not getting into the plant where it's needed. It's mainly caused by inadequate watering, inconsistent watering, and basically that's going to prevent calcium from being taken into the plant like it needs to be. So this, adding a supplemental calcium source like ground eggshells, is just going to make it really easy for your plant to take up that calcium, and it's going to prevent calcium deficiency problems like blossom end rot.
I've actually never had blossom end rot on my tomatoes, knock on wood, and I attribute this to the eggshells. I'm not sure, I'm not a scientist, but that's what I think. I've seen a lot of YouTube videos out there where people are putting really interesting and absurd things in their planting holes. For example, some people put complete eggs, like the whole egg in the planting hole. Some people put a whole banana or a whole or a cut up fish or a fish head. And while this may work, I've never actually tried it, so I can't tell you from experience. I'd like to try doing something like this someday, putting different things in the holes to see, what makes a difference, what makes my plant grow best. But right now I'm in the city. I have a very small garden, so I don't have much room for experimenting. But if you stick with my channel, someday I'm going to have my own property, and I'm going to be doing some tests to see, if there's anything out there that's really going to boost my tomato production. But one thing I thought of is, I wonder if you take a banana and you dry it out, or maybe you just dry the peel out and grind it up in like a coffee grinder or a blender. And if you put that in the planting hole, maybe that'd be a great source of potassium. I'd be interesting to see, because potassium, like I said before, it's a nutrient that in general, it's just good for overall plant health. Roots, shoots, fruits, everything. So I would really like to try putting some ground bananas in the planting holes, but that'll be for another day. So then what I do is I just mix it up. Just mix her up. Okay. Get a nice mix up in there. And then next up is to get your tomato plant, and take it out of its pot. Now what I do is I put my fingers over it like this. See how the tomato plant is between my fingers. I turn it upside down, kind of squeeze it like that, and it just plops right out. And this works best if your soil is somewhat moist but not soaking wet. So this soil is perfectly moist right now. As you can see, the plant is not root bound at all. It's looking very, very healthy in there, very happy. All right, so once you have your tomato plant out of its pot, your next step is to plant it. Now this is a real fun part. You guys are gonna love this. So what you do, or what I do, is I just make sure I have enough room there. And with tomatoes, something really interesting is that they develop roots all along their stem. So see these little hairs? You probably can't see that in the camera, but these are all gonna develop into roots. And as I said before, roots are key to bigger harvests and more delicious tomatoes. So what I do is I plant my tomato pretty much up to the top. I'd say in general 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 leaf branches, but in this case you can see all the branches are pretty much concentrated right at the top, so I'm not going to pick any off. I'm just going to plant it up to about here. So this is how I do it. Put it in like that. And I try not to break the root ball, but sometimes it happens a bit. And I just put it in there, and I just backfill the soil on it. Try to get next to the stake, about a couple inches away. And you see, I buried a lot of the stem there, pretty much right up to the leaves. And that's exactly what I do with all my tomatoes, and it just works wonders for me. All right, so that's pretty much done. Now what you can do is you can create a little moat around the plant, like that. Or like a dish like this. I kind of created a hill, which is pretty much the opposite of what you should do, but something like this. And then when you water, the water will actually stay in there within that region, and it's gonna really get that tomato off to a good start. A big mistake I see a lot of people make when planting tomatoes is they don't plant their tomatoes deep enough. A lot of people plant their tomatoes at soil level, and this is really not taking advantage of the fact that tomatoes root along their stem, which is what I love to do. So guys, if your tomato plant is really long, say it's like 2 feet long, no big deal. All you do is dig a little trench. So like, instead of digging a hole, I'll dig a trench like this. And then what you can do is you can just put the root ball at this end and then lay the tomato stem along here. And then the plant will actually grow here, the root ball's here, and it works just fine. I've done that with tomatoes that I've started way too early. One time I started a tomato plant like 2.5 months before my last frost, and it was just like literally 3 feet long. And I did that method. I literally pinched off like, I'd say maybe 7 or 8 leaf branches, and it worked out just fine. I had an amazing harvest, so it works really well. So that's just a quick tip for you guys. If you have super tall plants, not a big deal at all. Just dig a trench and do the same thing I did with this one. Compost and manure, bone meal, and eggshells. All right, so now the tomato plant is in the ground and it's got its nutrients. Now we need to water it in. So to water my tomato plants, especially when they're just getting started, I just use a handy dandy watering can. This is just a, standard watering can. Got it from my local garden center. And it's not rocket science, just fill it with some water. I use tap water because I live in the city and we don't have any what's the word I'm looking for? Wells. We don't have any wells or points to get free water like you guys in the country, you lucky guys. So now I just water it in. Try to go in a circle around the plant, circular motion, as opposed to watering like right on top of the plant. That way I'm just gonna minimize the risk of disease. So ideally, you should plant your tomatoes when it's overcast outside, but sometimes this just isn't possible. You're very busy, maybe you work, and sometimes you have to plant when it's really sunny, really hot outside. So what I'd recommend in that case is to actually go to your blue box and get out just any old box, any old cardboard box, cereal box, cracker box, whatever, what have you. Doesn't even have to be a box, just some sort of material. Then come over to your tomato plant, and what I do is I just take the box, and it's hard to do with one hand here, but just basically fold it in half, like so, and I just put it over the plant like this. And what that's going to do is it's just going to prevent the direct sun from hitting your plant. And so I just leave this on for around a day, just enough time for my tomato plant to kind of get used to its new environment. Then I'll take it off and expose it to the sun. This isn't really necessary, but it's just a precaution you can take to prevent shock. It's not really necessary to do this, but it's just one extra step to prevent transplant shock. What I want to highlight for you guys is that, if your tomato plants don't look too good, like this one right here, see this? It's looking okay, but it's not looking like it's growing that much. Basically what I do is I look at the new growth, the growth tips.
So as you can see, it's looking pretty good, pretty green. And in that case, I can tell if the tomato plant is going to survive. And this one right here, I'm probably gonna leave it in. I might replace it, not sure yet, but basically, the point I'm trying to make is that your tomato plants might look very ratty for the first couple weeks, but there will come a point where they're just gonna start really taking off and really growing strong. Like this one right here has already pretty much achieved that state where it's growing strong. But that's because this one was actually pretty big when I planted it. These ones here were like very small seedlings when I planted them. So I started my tomatoes a little too late this year. So that's why they're so small at this point. Usually they should be around at least, close to a foot. But I had a busy schedule and I planted a little later than normal. If your tomatoes look a little ratty, they're probably gonna bounce back. So you should be okay.
All right, guys, so that's it for today's video. I hope that you found it useful, and I think if you use this method to plant your tomatoes, you're gonna see some really good success. You can just take some key points from what I said in this video. You don't necessarily have to actually do exactly what I do, but I think if you apply some of the tips and techniques that I talked about in this video, you should be good to go. You're gonna have amazing harvests as long as the weather's nice. And yeah, so good luck with your tomatoes. I know you can do it. Tomatoes are a great crop to grow. They're super easy if you get it right, which I know you will. Have a great day. I'm Lucas from Lucas Grows Best, and as always, grow it best.